Good evening, viewers. This is the Ace Commander podcast. My name is Alex.
And my name is Atle.
And today we're going to discuss a little bit of Erikson's philosophy. And now, so he was a German-American psychologist who worked between the early 20th century.
Yeah, early 20th century.
And, he came with this, I came up with this idea of the stages of psychosocial development. We wanted to discuss this a little bit because it kind of gives you an idea or a scaffolding for the stages of your development throughout your life. And so if you can look at a piece of this and say, oh man, I didn't really develop this very well. So maybe if your social skills are lacking, and that was definitely me at a certain point, then you can look at it and say,
you don't have to be so self-critical. I think we've all kind of experienced, a little bit of a disconnect from social situations at one point or another.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, as a teenager, as an introverted teenager, it was difficult to make friends, and I know a lot of people can relate to that. But for
me, it was the opposite. I was very extroverted, and then after high school, I became introverted, and we'll get into a little bit more of those stories in a bit.
It's kind of fascinating to look at these stages of life and see where you might have been a little bit deficient, and there's no shame in that because I've definitely been there, especially throughout my teenage years, and that's pretty well outlined in the psychosocial stages of life here by Erikson.
Yeah, so we're just kind of going over these just to not necessarily list them off. We're going to have a good discussion on each stage. But beyond that, it's important to be very introspective about this topic and really kind of ask yourself if you might have had like a hiccup or something in any of these stages in your life, and kind of go through it. From personal experience, I went through a lot, not all these stages, because some of these stages are things you go through when you're like,
in your 40s
or whatnot, but it's still healthy for your brain, almost kind of as exercise, to go through each of these stages and kind of determine what you might be lacking in, and what you have already passed you don't really have to worry about.
Very similar to our Maslow's Hierarchy of Needs episode. Shameless self-plug, episode 2, Maslow's Hierarchy of Needs. You build up your competencies based off of the first stages of this, and so just like our Maslow's episode, we're going to be starting from the most basic concepts here, the basic stages of psychosocial development, so that we can kind of discuss them further, and so that you can see where your foundation may need a little bit of fixing, right?
A little bit of more concrete,
So
add some more stuff there.
so just like our Maslow's Hierarchy of Needs episode, I'm going to go ahead and list these off, and then we're going to discuss them in a more detailed manner, so that we can have some framework for how these ideas can be implemented in your life.
Sure.
So first of all, we have this first stage, which is generally between the ages of 0 and 1.5. So a lot of you don't remember that early, but Erikson called it trust versus mistrust.
Yeah.
The second stage between the ages of 1.5 and 3, autonomy versus shame. And then stage 3 between the ages of 3 and 5, initiative versus guilt. Stage 4, industry versus inferiority, 5 through 12. Then identity versus role confusion, which is roughly between the ages of 12 through 18. And stage 6, intimacy versus isolation, between the ages of 18 through 40. I'm almost through these, I promise. Stage 7, generativity versus stagnation. That's the ages of 40 through 65. And then the very last here, ego integrity versus despair, which is 65 plus.
Right.
Now,
yet again, I would like to remind anyone listening that the age I wouldn't pay too much attention to, because when this was written about 50 or so years ago, life was a lot more linear for them. So this made a lot more sense age-wise for them. But nowadays, because of not just technology, but how society has been developing so rapidly, it's a lot more hectic. So to feel that you have, went through a lot of these stages, but you haven't went through the first stage yet, isn't super uncommon. like psychologically speaking.
Right. So the first stage, for example, is trust versus mistrust.
Yeah.
And so if you haven't gone through this very well, so if you were raised in a household that was a little bit dysfunctional, then that doesn't mean that you're condemned to a life of mistrust, right? The negative aspect of this portion of development.
These are things you can still work on, for sure.
Exactly. There are things you can work on later, and the age ranges aren't set. It's just when you classically develop these characteristics as observed by Erikson in his clinical practice.
Yeah.
So, and I also wanted to put a little disclaimer here. This is not for academic purposes. This is more for your own personal development. And so if you can look at this and gather a framework similar to the Maslow's hierarchy of needs episode, you can look at it and look at little bits of it and say, oh, I'm not feeding myself very well. Maybe this is why I'm having issues in my life, or I'm having this recurring problem, right?
Yeah, I guess you could maybe think of it a little academically, because we basically compressed a lot of this information.
Right, we're trying to make it as dense as possible so that it can come off as clearly and as concisely as possible. So again, this is. You can develop the skills that are indicative per each stage of this later on in your life. So I want to make that very clear. Again, with the trust versus mistrust stage, which is between the ages of 0 and 1.5, well, you can still do trust exercises when you're an adult. You just have to realize, maybe this is why I have trust issues, is because my mother left me at a young age. Not to make the mood really dark here, but
and that's actually something that's a bit more personal for me. Is and I'm not going to get too in depth or emotional about this, because it's not really like a giant deal for me personally, but it wasn't something that was really taught to me as a tiny little baby. So having the whole trust and mistrust thing was kind of something I had to work on as an adult. I'm not saying anything bad about my parents. It was just something that they, I guess, just didn't. They didn't know about
focus
this.
on it, right?
Yeah, exactly. They did. I'm sure they didn't read Erikson's work, so it's not like something that they prioritized. But it's definitely still something that I was able to work on, and it didn't necessarily stunt my development. It was just something that, for me, was very important to work on later. And I personally think it's something that's very important for everyone to work on at some point in their life, because having trust and having the hope to trust someone, or just having hope in general, which is something that you eventually gain from this stage, is very important for just your success in life. Not just your success like socially, but also your success as like a business, or as a entrepreneur, or as a entertainer, or basically anything, because the ability to trust others, or even learn who not to trust, is an important skill to have if you want to be successful.
Right, and so this stage of development is not one that we're going to touch on too far. But however, if you have any deficiencies in this area and you have a hard time trusting people, whether it be your family, your friends, special someone, or co-workers, oftentimes it's because your care was inconsistent during this period of time between 0 and 1.5, roughly. And so that just means that you're, whoever was your caretaker at the time, whether it was your biological mother or someone that adopted you, it was unpredictable, unreliable, and then you developed a sense of mistrust and suspicion as a result of that. Now, again, I don't think that we need to touch on this too much. again, if you're deficient in this area, then figure out how to trust people, because I think that most people are generally good and they are trustworthy as long as you don't push them beyond what their competency is.
Most people aren't malicious.
Yeah, so they're not going to intentionally dump on you.
And the best thing to do when it comes to working on this, from my perspective, is just meet new people. Just go out and shake hands with people that you don't know. Introduce yourself. Be a little bit more outgoing, and you kind of over time gain that trust just from talking to people that you don't know.
Yeah, at this point we're talking in a past tense here, because I don't think that a 1.5-year-old is going to understand what we're saying.
Right.
So most people listening are going to be older than the age of 1.5, and so if you can look back at this and say, oh, my mom wasn't really good at this sort of stuff, then you can see, well, maybe this was the point in time where I learned to mistrust people, and that is something to be worked on if you have an issue with it.
Yeah.
So the second stage here, well, we're just going to move right along, is autonomy versus shame and doubt. And to kind of explain this a little bit, so first of all, it's the second stage of Erikson's stages of psychosocial development.
It's a mouthful. I get it, man.
I know. I'm having some trouble. It's like my all this. What is it called when you can't read properly? I'm just having the most trouble here. The word escapes me. I don't know. So it usually happens between the ages of 18 months to approximately 3 years old. Children at this stage are generally focused on developing a sense of personal control over physical skills and then learning a sense of independence. And so generally speaking, if you have a deficiency in willpower, it's because there was some sort of hiccup at this stage between about 1.5 to 3 years old. And if you can't tell, we're kind of glazing over these because we're naming a virtue to be worked on, but we're not speaking specifically to 18-month-old and 3-year-olds. We're speaking to adults or teenagers or people who have kind of found their way in the world and found a way to navigate this. So,
nevertheless, having a stage where you do work through the ability to gain willpower is definitely something anyone should work on, and not just work on, but also achieve that kind of independence with this specific stage. And you don't, I mean, when you're this young, going around and kind of exploring is kind of like how you gain that willpower. But as an adult, it's a little bit more complicated.
Right, and we can explain that in more detail. If you are a parent or you are somebody who's trying to learn to do this at an older age, this comes down to learning micro-routines. And we've talked about micro-routines again in the Maslow's Hierarchy of Needs episode. Building micro-routines, just to kind of give you the definition of this, is to learn all of the small components that make a larger macro-routine. So, for example, if you're learning to play the guitar, you need to learn to hold the guitar, you need to learn to strum, you need to learn how to place your fingers on the fretboards so that they actually resonate and make a note. One really good story with this, and just to give you an idea here, my dad taught me how to mow the lawn at one point in my life. And this sort of thing, he actually walked me through step by step how to use the mower so that I could do this macro routine, so that when he again asked me, hey, go mow the lawn, then I know, okay, well, I need to go outside to the shed. I need to make sure that this mowing machine is filled with gas, so I need to untwist this cap, fill it with gasoline. I need to prime it, press this little button on it. Yeah. I didn't know why it worked that way, but hold down the handle and pull the what do you call that? Pull the little starter mechanism thing there, and then I go around in a specific pattern in order to cut the grass on the lawn, and that's a macro routine. So if you're at this point, this is where you're starting to teach your child how to do these particular macro routines that involve a lot of really small parts, a lot of small moving parts. So you have to start with those little tiny things, and So again, the way that you implement this is that you present the macro routine as a set of micro routines. A lot of parents just do this naturally.
Yeah, and I like that story, by the way.
Oh, thank you very much. It's a personal story. You do a lot of small things and present it to your toddler at this particular age, or even older. Another reason that I think that this doesn't refer to a specific age necessarily, and another reason that I think that you can learn how to do different macro routines, like learn a new instrument, later in your life. You just have to present it to yourself in a certain manner that you're breaking it into pieces and learning how to do all those specific pieces effectively.
And understanding how it works comes later. Like, you don't necessarily have to, like... I think that might be one problem that some parents, especially now, might have, is that they feel like they have to explain to their 3-year-old like how the mower works for them to understand the macro routine.
Well, do you as an adult know how that works though?
No.
Like, tell me how a combustion engine works. Okay,
no,
go.
I'm good.
Right, you get a little lost on that, but basically the point is that to a child, a larger routine, something that is a task, do the dishes, mow the lawn, clean your room, is composed of a bunch of smaller things. Again, if you're talking to a toddler, you need to show them, okay, the toys go in the toy box, the garbage goes in the garbage bin, and in order to make your bed, you need to make the blanket straight on the bed. And so you show them how to do all of this stuff, and then when you say, hey, go clean your room, they understand exactly what you're talking about. Yeah. And you know people who have trouble with this, kids often, who have trouble with these particular macro routines. It's because they didn't get a lot of this, they didn't have these established micro routines in this stage of autonomy versus shame and doubt.
Right.
So when you do this wrong, you get the virtues or the anti-virtues of shame and doubt, and so they don't think that they can do things by themselves.
They have that lack of willpower
and a lack of confidence.
Lack of confidence. They need a little bit more direction instead of being more independent.
Exactly. So that ends up being an issue because underconfident people as adults often don't get as far as people who can even pretend what they know what they're doing. Right. So
that's a good skill to have, is to pretend if you know how to do something.
Yeah, it's that confidence that's established when you're when you're performing something, when you're expected to be a leader, or even when you're expected to perform a certain task. If you're insufficient in this particular area, that's just because maybe you didn't develop so well at this point. And so the solution that we've constructed for this is to build up your macro routines by breaking them down into smaller things and working on those individually.
And that could be literally something as simple as learning how to play the guitar. Something you don't have to really do it, go out of your way and like build a combustion engine to really feel like you accomplished something. But just learning anything, even if it's something like cooking, which everyone should probably learn how to cook at some point.
And we touched on this a little bit. So I mean, we're only on the second stage here, and we're already getting kind of far into the weeds, which I really like.
Yeah.
We've discussed how learning a certain macro routine can make you confident in this thing. And so if you are really good at playing guitar, then you can be like, wow, I mean, imagine what I could do with this. I could become a musician. I could play music for my own well-being. I could attract mates with this. This is it gets down to a really fundamental level.
Very fundamental, yeah.
Not to mention, if anyone asks you, hey, how did you get so good at guitar? You can confidently answer that question. Well, hey, I'll tell you exactly what I did. I learned how to pick the guitar. I learned how to hold it. I learned how to press my fingers down on the frets so that the notes actually resonate. And you've broken this down to the point where you can explain it to someone and teach really effectively. Yeah. So that gets a little bit into teaching theory, but we're not going to go that far off into the distance
we
quite
really
yet.
Don't need to now for this.
No, it's pretty straightforward. The stage 3 here is initiative versus guilt, and this. I think that the title of this is a little bit misleading. The way that I would explain this is playing games and socializing with other kids. And so this is between the ages of 3 to 5. This is when you should be socializing your children. And it's funny when you watch kids play with each other, they construct these different types of games that they've learned, and they all play by the rules, but a lot of times they don't even understand. They wouldn't be able to recite the rules to you if they needed to.
Right. I wouldn't say that the name of the stage is too misleading, because it's kind of true. Because this is the point where someone is becoming social. And during their time in these social groups, they either have the initiative to, basically either start be the fawns, I guess, of the group, or the guilt portion could be the opposite of the fawns and be more like an outcast and do things that aren't socially accepted, and then the outcome would feel guilt from not being accepted by your peers.
And how do you combat this as an adult? If you didn't develop very well on this stage and you have a hard time socializing, then what would you recommend to these adults who are listening to this?
Definitely, I could imagine, for the most part, a lot of people that have a deficiency in this particular stage is mostly that to begin with, they're probably pretty introverted. So going out and just socializing with people is a good way. Kind of like with the first stage, being around people. Not necessarily getting too involved, especially if you don't have that confidence, but just being with people, seeing how they interact with other people, just learning, you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
Seeing how other people, what is acceptable and what's not acceptable.
Right. So this is kind of where you learn the social rules and understand how to conduct yourself in front of people. So like like the classic, if you have a preschooler that's flicking boogers on people, they start to understand really quick that that's not an appropriate thing to do, because they might get yelled at by their teacher, or this other little 4-year-old or 5-year-old in kindergarten or preschool is going to get mad at them. Well, I don't like boogers flicked on me, and they'll learn pretty quickly that that's not an appropriate thing to do well into adolescence or adulthood.
Yeah.
So that, it also establishes a virtue of purpose, and so you find that you're able to conduct yourself well with other people, and so it gives you a purpose. It gives you something to focus on, something to do.
It's not necessarily, when it comes to purpose, something as great as a career path, because, what 5-year-old cares about a career path? I mean, they might be like, I want to be a fireman when I grow up, or something, like some stereotypical thing, but it's more the sense that you contribute to your tribe. And this is kind of going back to what we were talking about in the second episode as well, is the kind of tribe mentality, which that's there, it's not going anywhere, so you kind of have to get used to it.
Right.
But feeling useful in a community, that's where the sense of purpose comes from.
Right. So you basically establish at this point, and to me this seems like it's really, really young to do this, but again, this is based on clinical research by the psychologist Erikson.
It seems young, but to me it makes sense, because it's very almost subconscious, because you're not necessarily developing this in a day. You're developing this over a period of years.
Right.
And especially when you're younger, studies have shown that younger people just absorb more information. And I'm not saying that you can't absorb information as quickly as an adult, because that's not true either. It's just because there's a lack of Man, I'm cutting short here.
Yeah, you're shooting a blank here.
I'm shooting a blank.
To kind of pick up on this a little bit, so you have your tribe, you have your group of little 3 or to 5-year-olds that you're hanging out with, and so you're contributing something to them, whether it be a new game or whether it be like even if it's something as funny as like, hey, look how far I can stick this crayon up my nose.
Thank you. See, like, that's the point I was trying to get across.
Yeah. So that's where you learn. That's where you learn humor. This is where you learn how to socialize with people in a general sense, and what people like and what people don't like. And again, it seems like it's just a tiny bit young to me. You can still learn this in later stages. Figure out like, oh man, how do I learn to socialize with people? Let's say that you're a high schooler and you're trying to focus on this more. Well, for starters, you should look at people in the eye when you're communicating with them. People love jokes. People love humor. They'll like being around you if you're funny, or if you smile when they're talking about something and you look like you're listening. These are little strategies that you learn at this point in your life. And if you don't, then you can still pick it up later. It's not a big deal. So the fourth stage here is industry versus inferiority. So to kind of explain this a little bit, children at this stage are at a kind of psychological crossroads here, where they're learning to read and write, to do their maths and their all their really basic tasks, understanding how to function intellectually in the world, figuring out how to do things on their own. And it's not necessarily the confidence to do these things on their own, but learning how to function in an academic environment. So this, it seems like when we looked at this whole theory, Erikson's theory on the psychosocial stages of life, it was based off of a more or less Western cultural idea of how children are raised.
Yeah.
So one thing that's included on this is that children feel like they need to win approval from other human beings, whether that be their peers or it be their family. This is a major source of self-esteem for them. Also, more well establishing at this point. They're more well establishing at this point with their cliques and their tribes and their friend groups. I've made friends between the ages of 5 and 12 that I still have now. So that's a good way to present that, I think. So you build your self-esteem at this point. You're understanding that, again, this concept of industry versus inferiority means that if you are competent at more things, then you feel more self-confident. Everyone knows that 5 to 12-year-old who is just like, top of the world. They think that they're really hot stuff, and it's just because they got an A in their math class or something. They're just they're learning how to become competent in our world.
Yeah, they're that A-type guy, just like straight up out of a comic.
Yeah, and this, we could get into a whole nature versus nurture discussion about this, but I don't think that we need to go off on that tangent right now. This is generally, again, between the ages of 5 through 12, and so you can just imagine these sort of kids and the psychosocial challenges that they're going through at this time, trying to learn how to function in our world in a way that is socially acceptable. It builds off of the last stage here, just like our Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Right. It's kind of a
foundation.
pyramid in a way. Even these stages, when you think about it, because you need to have like a foundation for it to go off of.
Yeah.
And this one, in my opinion, is pretty important, because learning to be competent at what you do, not just being able to do what you do, whether it's something simple like a chore or something, is very important for being successful in your life. Because like let's use an example, like pretty basic one, washing dishes. Like you got the soap, you got the hot water, and then you just kind of like brush them and stuff, and then you put them in the little carriage to dry off or whatever. I mean, that's maybe not the most cohesive example, because most people just use their dishwasher, but hey, I'm gonna go with it.
Right.
So if you don't do it very well, you'll still have some grease and grime on your dishes, and you'll have to wash them again. And that kind of goes with the whole efficiency discussion that we were talking about in the last episode. So competency kind of equals efficiency, like how good you are at doing something. If you're competent, if you learn what you're good at, in the earlier stages, and then you become competent at it, you feel like you can be successful at it, even if it's something as simple as washing dishes.
And this competency bleeds over to other things too. So if you're really good at one thing, and it could even be washing dishes, but if you have a whole list of competencies, then you think, hey, I could be good at other things too. So generally speaking, these people who are good at a whole range of macro routines will become really good at a range of other things as they grow up and as they develop. And generally speaking, the only thing that's lacking in this department is direction. And so with younger folk, they don't really know what they want to be career-wise, and they don't really know what to develop in that sense. And the recommendation I give to these people who are having a hard time in this stage of development is to figure out what you are good at and then develop on that more.
Yeah, this is something that I brought up in the last episode as well, which is a problem that I had, which is I was kind of like the jack of all trades, master of none growing up. And so I didn't have necessarily a direction in what I wanted to do. So learning later on, or I guess not later on now, but within the last few years, I was able to kind of compress my knowledge down to what I need to know. And not just compress my knowledge down to what I need to know, but also focus on the skills that I was good at, and kind of not necessarily throwing away, but not giving as much attention to the things that I wasn't. So
you don't become bad at things that you haven't practiced. And so if you learn how to change a tire, you learn how to ride a bike, and you learn how to tie your shoes, then you're not going to forget how to do those things if they're fairly common practice. You learn how to do them once, and then you're like, oh, wait, I remember how to do this. Okay, I'm good. But those things don't feed into a greater purpose, which is, let's say you want to become a musician, and you have to learn all these separate macro routines in order to do that. Then you're not totally hosed. You just know how to do a bunch of other little things like wash the dishes or vacuum the floor, and you know how to do all of these things because you've been properly raised up. If you don't, then the internet is a really good source. So we're really lucky these days. And if you don't know how to work let's say you don't know how to work a dishwasher, well, you can figure that out if you weren't taught this sense of confidence in trying new things.
Yeah.
So
I tell people all the time, if they don't know how to do something, I'm just like, Google it. Because I'm in a position where people like to ask me questions a lot, just because I know a lot of things, and whether those things are really relevant or not, that's a different story. But I usually end up just telling people to Google it, because I've answered so many questions during my lifetime that it's become kind of a chore to answer questions. And that's kind of the downside with knowing a lot of things, but at the same time, it's still useful to know a lot of these things. It's just, if you want to be successful in something, it's best to be really knowledgeable in what you want to do.
Yeah, absolutely. One example I'd present here is that the classic college student that doesn't know how to cook. That's a really basic task.
That's what I was talking about before.
Oh, yeah. So that's a really basic task, and that's something you'd be able to look up how to do. You know what ingredients you need to get. It's just a matter of breaking it down into smaller pieces so that you can do it one step at a time, because you're not going to learn how to cook if you don't know how to cook several different types of meals. And there is a point where you can say, yes, I am a competent cook. But it's going to be kind of arbitrary. It'll be different for everybody. Let's say that I know how to cook spaghetti, eggs, and make cereal really well. Yes, I'm a good cook. I might think that, but someone else might not. So maybe in the professional realm, you're not going to reach that point. But again, that relates to this fourth stage of development.
Right.
Now, the fifth stage here is one that we could talk for hours about, and so we'll have to hold back a little bit. It's identity versus role confusion. Now, this is between the ages of 12 and 18, roughly. So in those adolescent years that are really confusing, this is when you become mentally coherent, and you can really tell when you're struggling with your identity. So this is when you start to remember all of the this psychosocial struggle. Beforehand, it doesn't really matter so much because you're a kid, and it's like, eh.
This is the point where philosophy actually becomes important.
Absolutely, yeah. Because if you brought up the concept of Stoicism, for example, to a 5-year-old or to an 8-year-old, they're going to understand the words you're saying, but they won't have any sort of frame of reference to actually understand it.
Yeah.
So at this fifth stage, I want to explain it a little bit, and then explain why I think that Stoicism is a good antidote to this sort of situation, or this role confusion negative part of this stage of development. So generally speaking, when it comes to teenagers, they're trying to find a way to label themselves. You see this a lot in the way that high schoolers hang out with each other. So the cliques that they create, that's not necessarily a problem. So if they establish that into their identity, then that's okay. So if I'm a big D&D player and I hang out with all of the kids who are D&D players, and that's a part of my identity, I'm a D&D player, that's not an issue. It's when these identities become kind of ideological, that they become a little bit toxic. So if you identify as and this is not to like pick anyone out or to pick on anyone, make fun, but if you identify as a wolf, or if you identify as an attack helicopter, or these other kind of constructs, these kind of constructs, then that may become an issue, and that's usually because you're trying to find a tribe or a group of people that share the same ideology.
Yeah, and I agree. I personally think that it's more important to identify with cliques during this time than to try to be special. And that's kind of like a big issue with younger folk, is that they try so hard to be special that they're no longer useful. And that's not necessarily useful in society's standards. That's like useful in your standards as well, personally. So you end up spending so much time and effort trying to identify and to basically be as far away from all of these constructs as possible, that you kind of alienate yourself. And that's one of the reasons why Stoicism is a very important philosophy to learn during this time, because you can combat the flood of emotions and hormones with very concentrated and direct thought.
Yeah, this is the period of life where you should be exploring different versions of ideas, different versions of identities, and like, for example, let's say that you're confused about your sexual preference, and this is included in this too, is sexual identity.
Yeah.
It's just identity in general as a blanket term, finding your identity. A lot of people figure themselves out when they were teenagers. Yeah. The Stoicism philosophy plays in here because as you're exploring different options, let's imagine this for a moment. If you grow up in a really conservative state and you like dudes, well, you're not going to be accepted by a lot of your close peers who are, grew up in conservative households. You may not be accepted by your family. Maybe they think this is a really weird idea. Well, Stoicism plays in the regard that you're able to look at this in a really logical manner and say, okay, these are my feelings. This is how I think about the situation. I guess I am attracted to men as a man, and I don't need to bother about what everyone else thinks about this. It's about being authentically you.
Yeah, it's no longer you trying to fit into a social construct that you basically created that didn't even exist in the first place. to take a step back and look at yourself as a being and understand what makes you you without putting any type of specific label on it. Just understanding what you represent. And most of the time, you don't even need to have a label. Like while I was growing up, I knew, many people, including myself, who were a part of these subcultures who didn't identify with these subcultures. We just kind of accepted it as a part of our life and never really thought about it. It was just who we were.
Right, and so that's one thing that gets into a more when you're a little bit more developed, is separating yourselves from these identities that you've placed on yourself. And so you're not looking at yourself as a high school student, an anime lover, a gay man, a track runner, a whatever it might be. You don't have to put all of these labels on yourself in order to accept what you are, right? So it's
very important to come to terms with that as well, in my opinion.
Yeah. In the same vein, when you're in this stage of development, you're also trying to figure out what you're going to do for the rest of your life. And so, especially at like high school graduations, you always hear speeches about this is the beginning of the rest of our lives, and
that kind of plays almost with your identity as well, like how you see yourself. Because that might kind of put you in a certain direction to be closer with certain cliques, and it might put you in a certain direction to follow a certain career path. And your clique might actually play a role in that as well, which in my opinion is incredibly healthy, because if nothing else, that can just catapult you to success.
Right.
Because then you have a community.
So another thing I wanted to touch on is that in the goal-setting sense, when you are in this stage of development, you should have multiple goals that really click with you. And especially in a more complicated world, you can engage in multiple activities that are fulfilling to you for different reasons. So if you have your job that makes money for you, so that you can have your side hustles, whatever they may be. In our case, that's like, let's make music, let's make a podcast, and let's hang out and do fun stuff, right? I have my other side hustles, and I'm doing really heavy air quotes here, like playing Diablo. I want to make a really strong character. That's one of my goals. That's totally fine. You should have your goals and things that you can put your time and energy into. But you don't need to have a plan B necessarily. So you don't need to have a backup plan. Just find something that works for you.
Right, and I would like to kind of work off of that a bit. While I was growing up, I was always told, because I was very much of an artistic personality growing up, and I'm still very artistic, but I was always told you need to have a plan B. And to me, that did not make sense. And even to this day, it doesn't make sense, because it insinuates the idea of not putting 100% in everything you do. Whereas on the opposite side of the spectrum, if you just have multiple goals, then you're never going to not be successful, basically. Like, let's say you want to be a great musician. You work on your music, but you also want to start a business. So you work on your business as well. As long as you are efficient with time management, you're going to be successful in one or both of those.
Right. You can do both things at once. It really isn't a big deal. You may there are very few people who are not able to do two things at once in their life, right?
Yeah.
So you do multiple things in your lives, whether you think so or not. Let's say that you work 40 hours a week. Well, outside of that, you have your personal relationships, and you have your video game time, and you have your TV watching time. All that you really have to change in that case is to replace one of those activities that isn't so healthy for you and do something that is more fulfilling and that will give you a reward.
Or like isn't really a goal. Like, okay, does watching TV really help you with something? Or like does it really inform you in a career path that you want to take? It doesn't even have to be a career path. It could be just like something you want to be really good at. Like, let's say for, this is kind of a weird example, but let's say you want to be a film critic. So you watch a lot of movies just to get a good idea of what's good. That's a good use of your time if you're really into movies and you want to be a film critic, or at least like almost as like you said, like a side hustle. You want to be something like a film critic. You could just watch a lot of movies, or like you were saying, you really like playing Diablo, so in your free time you like playing Diablo, and then you want to get really good at playing Diablo, so you want to get in the higher tier.
Right.
It's become at that point a goal. It's no longer just like some frivolous thing you do. It's something you're going to be or you are good at.
And that's really good for you type A personalities out there, people who want to achieve things, is you can set goals with just about anything, and that is so healthy for you. Even if it is like, I want to get together with my girlfriend and we're going to watch all of American Horror Story. We're going to watch all of the Lord of the Rings series because she hasn't seen it before. Something like that. That's totally fine. You want to, you essentially, you're putting yourself in a spot where you have a target, and then you're making that happen. You're actively making that happen. I should say too that it is okay to waste your time in a way that relaxes you. So I don't want this discussion to make it seem like, hey,
don't waste your time,
don't
youngin'.
you dare do stuff that's fun. No, not at all. I'm just saying that don't make excuses for not reaching your goals or not reaching for them at all, right? Not even taking baby steps toward them, because if you wanted to become a master guitar player and all you do is watch TV after work, well,
you have no one except yourself to blame.
Exactly. Yeah. All you have to do is spend half an hour after work every day and just practice a little bit. It's really an easy thing to do, and that can become a part of your identity, assuming that you're in this stage of life, in this fifth stage. I wanted to talk a little bit about the role confusion side of this, because we talked a little bit about the positive side, which is identity, finding your identity, figuring out what works for you, and figuring out what you want to do occupationally. Role confusion comes in a lot of different ways.
Manifestations.
For me, it was career oriented, and so I didn't know what I wanted to do in a career. Therefore, I didn't know what I wanted to do in school. Therefore, I didn't do well in school, right? So it became kind of this cascading problem. For some people, role confusion means that they think that they're like a duck person or like an attack helicopter, or, we made this joke before. For some people, and I'm not saying this is everybody, it also includes gender confusion, and so they find themselves fitting more as a female, as a biological female, identifying more with male roles, and so they say, well, I'm a male now. Right. So, and that isn't everybody. That is, I should make that abundantly clear, is that I'm sure that there are some people out there who are just wired incorrectly, and that's different, right?
That's a total different discussion. Yeah.
I don't, just judging based off of my own experience with teenagers, is that a lot of them don't know anything. It's like they have no idea what's going on, and you can't accurately judge the place that they're in, because they're still trying to figure out their own identity. And so a lot of times you can't even help with that, because they are trying to figure this out for themselves.
It's definitely more of a personal struggle, for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah, and you can walk people through this and ask them probing questions so that they can kind of help to articulate what they're thinking. But in this case, it's very deeply personal. Moving into the sixth stage of life, which is this is the one that we could talk about for ages, because
besides from the fifth one,
we're both in this stage of life. Intimacy versus isolation, which is from the ages of 18 through 40. Yeah. And this is where specifically for people who are straight out of high school, they're thrown into the world. And in my case, I chose to go to a college that was 2 hours away from where I grew up. And so I didn't have my tribe. I didn't have my people. I was in a really highly religious community as a non-religious person. And that was really difficult for me because I didn't have my people that I could be intimate with and that I could share.
Ground yourself, yeah.
I couldn't share any deeper ideas with anybody unless I was like playing video games or something, and then I could actually talk with my friends back home. So this is a really important thing to focus on for people who are just coming out of high school, even up to the ages of 40. You got to find your clique of people, your tribe that is all interested in roughly the same thing.
Yeah, and it can be the opposite extreme as well. For the people that, like, let's say they just got out of high school, yet again, bringing up this kind of this
situation. Paradigm.
Yeah, it's paradigm. There you go. That's the word I was searching for. I spend too much time searching for words when I could just say, anything else. Anyways, so for anyone in this paradigm, it's kind of like you just got out of high school and now you're in the workplace or you're in college or both, and you think that the same things that are acceptable in high school are still acceptable in the workplace or in college when things have evolved. You're no longer able to spend as much time socializing in the workplace because that's uncouth. You might be punished for spending too much time socializing, or even in some colleges, especially if they're more strict. Some universities might be like that as well. So finding a new clique is pretty difficult in after high school. I know a lot of people during that stage like to think that it's very difficult, and in some ways it is, finding your identity and whatnot. But once you get out, it's a whole new kettle of fish. Now you're trying to find a new tribe, or else you will feel the cold chill of isolation, which that's definitely something that happened to me. So this is definitely more of a personal story. When I was out of high school, just going back real quick, I was very extrovertive. I had I didn't really have a clique because I was cool with everybody, which is kind of my downfall, because instead of having a certain direction, I thought I could be cool with anybody. And then as soon as I was out of high school and I started working, it wasn't quite as easy.
It's a different world, definitely. One way that I think that people do this without even thinking about it is joining into groups of people that think roughly the same thing. And sometimes this is completely by accident. So for example, joining the military, I find a bunch of people that all relate to me in a lot of different ways. I suddenly have my group of people that I work with constantly, that I have known for a year or 2 years or almost 3 years now.
Wow.
And so I have my tribe, I have my group of individuals, and I'm part of a group. I think that for the same reason, a lot of people flock to religion, because everybody has the same sort of base ideals, the base values, and you have somewhere to congregate on a regular basis so that you can feel like you're socially included.
Thank you for bringing that up too, because that was actually the second part of my story, which was as soon as I felt that isolation, I started becoming desperate for a social situation. Places where I could feel that kind of that tribe mentality again, totally subconscious. It was just like this need, this drive, and that we live in Utah, and so you could find this kind of thing basically anywhere, but in Utah specifically, it's very like LDS oriented. Which is, for people who aren't really familiar with that, that's the Latter-day Saints. That's what they call it. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. That's what they call it. A lot of people just call them Mormons, which is a lot less of a mouthful. But anyways, so they have this kind of young adult kind of community, which is very open, very easy for anyone to get involved with. So for me, I was just like, oh, okay, this would be a great opportunity for me to just meet people and to have like a new clique, basically. I didn't use that word, obviously, but that's what subconsciously I was feeling. So I was pulled to these situations where I did not click, I'm using air quotes now, with anybody, because I had nothing in common with any of these people. I just thought that I would, instantly make friends with a bunch of people, where that was like not the case. A lot of the mannerisms that I used weren't necessarily accepted, and a lot of the mannerism that they used didn't really make sense to me. So there was this disconnect, which ended up backfiring on me, and I ended up feeling isolated all over again. And I, had to find new inventive ways to meet people.
Yeah, and I think everyone knows that feels like feeling isolated, which is the negative side of this stage of development.
Yeah.
So when you're trying to find your group of people, or trying to find your intimate relationships even, and that could span anywhere from having a solid foundation with your family, especially with your friends. This is what this refers to very specifically, is with your friends, people who think roughly the same thing, that can be a soundboard for your ideas, or set you straight if you're going on the path of neurosis or something that's just completely dysfunctional, right? So this can also extend to where you choose to live. So I'll make this example. If you're a non-religious person in Utah and you can't find people who are also religious, who are also Mormon, I have considered moving to another state where people are non-religious in order to fit in better, because the vast majority of the population are non-religious, and so I would agree on a lot of fundamental ideas that they have.
Right.
But eventually you can find people that relate to you almost anywhere.
Yeah, you can make do with what you've got, and in some cases you can do even better. Like, one problem that a lot of people here in Utah have that are not religious is they blame all their troubles on Mormons, which is really annoying because I've heard it so many times. And it's really not so cut and dry. A lot of the issues that non-Christians, or I guess even non-LDS people have in this state specifically, just coming from personal experience, is more like almost personal problems, like things that they need to deal with before they can, face their own, life.
Right.
And they just end up blaming it on their surroundings.
It's kind of a scapegoat for a lot of people who are bitter, who are
like
upset
jaded,
with,
basically.
Yeah, and it happens a lot with individuals who come away from the church too. So they kind of rip themselves. The church, excuse me, that is referring to the Mormon church.
They always call it the church.
The commonly accepted the commonly accepted terminology for that is the church, because there is no other church around here, and I'm sure that exists in other places in the country. But
and even in other countries, they might have their church, which is just like,
whatever dominates the area,
whatever.
right? So, but a lot of people pulling away from this religious sect from Mormonism get really bitter and blame the Mormon church for their issues, but a lot of times it's their own personal problems.
Yeah. They're kind of isolating themselves.
Exactly, and it's exactly this. And so while you're finding your identity in your teens and you're figuring out the religion is not for you, and then you grow up a little bit more, you reach your 20s and you feel like you're isolated because you don't have this group of people that was there before. But again, this is a common paradigm in this stage of intimacy versus isolation, and it just means that you need to find your group of people who agree with you.
Yeah.
And then you can feel like you have a home somewhere. You feel like you have your home base.
Right.
So
something to ground yourself.
This can also relate to political identity. So if you identify yourself more with conservatism or with liberalism or with moderatism, then that's awesome. So you're figuring that out at this stage in your life. You're no longer a soundboard for your parents or whoever's all around you. You're starting to think for yourself, and you're identifying with this group of people.
Right.
So this is where that's happening. Moving on to this seventh stage, and this is generally speaking from the age of 40 to 65 years old. Now, neither of us have gone through this stage of development, arguably because we're not 40 to 65, but again, it isn't so cut and dry.
Yeah, not in today's area. It's not, not in today's area. What am I talking about? Anyways, not in today's era is it quite as cut and dry, because, like I was saying at the beginning of the video, a lot of these stages can be jumbled, and you can go through them at either earlier than they're supposed to be gone through or even later. I personally think that we are, kind of delving into this.
Or at least making preparations for this stage.
Yeah. And it's basically feeling it. It's feeling that sense of purpose, but on a whole new level. Like you're not just feeling the sense of purpose, but you are achieving things. Yeah. Because if you don't, you'll feel stagnant. You'll feel useless. A bunch of other neurosis is just caused by this by itself. Very important stage in my opinion, because this is pretty much where you leave your mark on society.
I think that this could be, this stage anyways, the negative side of this, the stagnation side, could be to blame for the midlife crises that a lot of people have. And that can be characterized in a ton of different ways. There is actually another psychological term for a midlife crisis, which I'm completely spacing at this point. But fine. It's characterized by a lot of different things, which could be like anywhere from buying a motorcycle and feeling like you want to do things that you wanted to do in your youth, or cheating on your spouse. So it can go on either extreme.
Extreme.
It's just because you've reached this point of stagnation because you haven't left your mark in the way that you have wanted to. And that's what characterizes the positive side of this is generativity refers to making your mark on the world through creating or nurturing things that will outlast yourself.
Yeah.
So,
and just so anyone listening, you heard that correct. It's generativity, not general relativity. That's totally different.
This is different. That's a completely wrong science here. Just so everyone out there is aware. This one doesn't, again, we can't speak to this much because we haven't reached this point, but I will refer this back to the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Yeah. This is where you become more or less self-actualized. Yeah. So you've reached some sort of goal in your life, and let's say at this point you've written a book, or you've reached a point in your career where you're making enough money that you can take care of yourself and your children who should be taking care of themselves but maybe aren't. That would definitely be my parents in some senses. They're taking care of me more than they need to. My mom, for example, just sends me home with all this food. My dad gives me he just lends me all this stuff all the time. Oh yeah, you need to pull these pictures off your phone. Well, just take this. This is this will do it for you. Whoa. Thanks. They still pay my phone bill too. I'm 24 years old.
What a guy.
I know. So that's the point I'm trying to make. They're at a point where they are well into the stage. They are in this generativity stage, and I can see that pretty clearly. So they're at a point where they're like, oh yeah, we're doing pretty great in our lives.
So we might as well be a little bit more altruistic and help out our children and other people around.
Which is another philosophy that we were going to discuss in an entire episode, but I think it could be pretty well encompassed within this stage of within the stage of psychosocial development. So if you want to explain altruism a little bit to the audience here who might not know what we're talking about.
Yeah, definitely. Altruism is the concept of being selfless. So doing more for others, or doing things specifically because you want to make a statement for others. So it's like basically the opposite of selfishness. In my opinion, it is definitely a philosophy to look into, no matter what your age is. To be altruistic is to be evolved.
Right. It's
or at least, like Gandhi and Mother Teresa would think so.
it's just to reach a point where you are prosperous enough and you are comfortable enough that you can provide for the people that matter around you, and that could be your coworkers, it could be your family, your friends, etc., etc.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be on a global scale. You can be altruistic to your family. You can be altruistic to your close friends and your relatives. You can be altruistic to your fellow employees, or if you're a boss, to your employees. The list goes on. You can even you see a lot of stars and really successful rich people, like going to Ethiopia and feeding all these hungry children, and that's their way of being altruistic.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, it's arguable what the true definition of altruism is. I think that giving without without hope of a reward is a good way of putting it. In a way, these celebrities going and publicizing their charity may not be the most altruistic act, but that's a discussion for another episode, right? So
yeah.
it's giving, and they're not going to get anything back from these children in Africa, but they will get good publicity for it. And so it's like, what are you really doing this for, right? Is this cheaper than marketing yourself? Maybe. But again, this is that's a way. Altruism plays into this really well because it's a way to make your mark and to leave an impression on the people that are around you, that are in your tribe. We use that word a lot, but it's really important here.
It's just a very good word to describe what we're getting at.
Exactly, because it doesn't refer to any specific group of people.
Yeah, and it's very primal. Like, anyone can really understand the term.
Yeah. Our last stage of development here, the 8th stage of Erikson's psychosocial stages of life. We finally made it.
Playing this off, aren't you?
Hey, everybody, if you didn't know where to go, Erikson. Yeah, I'm not doing that. So now this is where you understand your part in the life cycle. So this is where you understand where your place is in the world. This is where you start to accept death. This is where you are self-actualized on a normal basis, assuming that you are in this ego integrity stage of development. And I don't think that either of us have touched on this much.
Not really. I mean, I think we've had a few discussions philosophically about what this stage represents, but we really haven't delved too deep into it. And I feel like you don't necessarily have to be 80 years old to really understand this concept, because the coming to terms with your mortality is something anyone and everyone should do.
Absolutely. It's actually a Stoic principle to consider your mortality. I think that nihilists do that as well, because they think, oh, we're all going to die, so it's kind of pointless to do anything great. But
you brought up earlier on today when we were discussing this process, you brought up
optimistic nihilism.
Yeah,
there's an optimistic version of nihilism, which basically you're able to consider that your life is pointless because you're going to die, so you may as well make the best of it. Especially if you're an atheist, optimistic nihilist, and you think, well, when my life is over, that's it, and that's all that's going to happen. I'm going to, it'll just be blankness forever. Well, you better make the best of your life then, because that's all you've got. So again, ego integrity here is basically accepting your part in the life cycle, accepting your death, looking back at your life achievements and saying, I did a good job.
Right.
I did good. My children are grown up, or I've made a huge impact with my charities, or I have done some great things in my life. Some people do. This isn't restricted to only 65-year-old people, as you have already put it. You can consider death beforehand. You can consider this paradigm even before you die, or before you're even close to dying, and say, I want to achieve as much as I can before I die. People who don't do that, who think that their life has been useless, often go into this despair side of this category, which obviously that's when you become afraid of death and you realize, I haven't really made my mark on the world. I haven't really done much to leave a name for myself.
Yeah, and to really prevent that from happening, an exercise that I do every year on my birthday is I actually look back on the following or the previous year, and I go over the pros and cons. Like, I go over what I've achieved and what I've done, and what I didn't do, and what I wanted to do, or what I think I should have done. I wouldn't get too much into it, because I have gone to the extreme, which is overdoing it, overanalyzing the previous year or overanalyzing the previous decade, and just like really, really feeling that despair for sure.
Right.
So yeah, definitely go easy on yourself, but kind of put together what you've done versus what you could have done better, and just try to make the next year a little bit more successful.
Yeah, most people listening to this podcast probably aren't 65 years old, and so you still have plenty of time to make your mark on the world, however that might be. You're able to affect things positively in a way that you can look back when you're 60 or 70 or 80 and say, I did great things, and then
thanks to those two guys.
I mean, I really hope that that's the case, is that they look back at this podcast like, thank you very much, Alex and Atle, you did it. No, really though, it's a matter of having a fulfilled life, and this ties really well into the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. When you get to this point, you should be in a self-actualized state where you have reached your goals. You may have more in the future, but hopefully at this point in your life, you can be boring your grandkids with stories of things that you did when you were younger, all of these great things that you did that make you feel fulfilled and like your life had a real purpose.
Yeah.
Right? So that just about covers our Erikson's psychosocial stages of life.
Oh.
So thank you everybody for joining us tonight. Again, this is a shameless ask of all of you listeners. If you would leave us a comment down below on anything that we could improve, if you're looking for anything in particular,
shameless. We definitely would like the feedback.
Exactly. I would really like the feedback. If there's any topic you want us to discuss or research at length so that we can discuss it on a podcast.
Yeah, and if you learn something, leave it a like. And another thing is, this is the week of Halloween. Ooh, spooky. So happy Halloween for everyone out there, and we'll definitely see you next time.
Yeah, we'll see you next time.